The wrought iron gates groaned in protest as Ellie navigated her battered Volvo through, the sound echoing like a dying man's rasp. Blackwood Manor loomed against the bruised twilight sky, a monument to forgotten grandeur and creeping decay. Slate tiles slipped from the roof. Ivy strangled the stone walls and the windows. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out over the Yorkshire moors. Ellie cut the engine, the silence that followed almost as unsettling as the screech of the gates. Her profession wasn't glamorous. Art restoration was a quiet, meticulous world of solvents and brushes, of coaxing life back into fading memories. But it paid the bills in a commission like this. Full-length portrait in a manor house steeped in history 30 could elevate her reputation, provided she didn't completely screw it up. She double-checked the directions. Old man Hemmings, the estate agent, had been odd on the phone, evasive about the Blackwood family, overly insistent on a quick turnaround. "Mr. Blackwood is a private man," he'd said, again and again. "He just wants the restoration completed efficiently." Ellie hoisted her kit bag, sooty brushes, scalpels, a portable light, an arsenal of cleaning solutions, and a small, well-worn sketchbook sooty and headed towards the imposing oak front door. The wood was scarred and weathered, the brass knocker tarnished to a dull green. She raised it, the sound reverberating within the house like a summons. The door was opened by a woman who looked as if she'd been carved from the same granite as the manor itself. Tall, severe, and dressed in a dark gray uniform that swallowed her whole. She offered no smile, no greeting. Just a cool, appraising stare. "Miss Albright?" she asked, her voice as crisp as fallen leaves. "Ellie Albright, yes? Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Follow me." The interior was a labyrinth of shadows and dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. The air hung heavy with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and something else, something vaguely metallic, almost like the faint smell of blood. Ellie found herself unconsciously running a hand over her arm, a prickle of unease settling on her skin. Rooms branched off the central hall, each larger and more imposing than the last. Faded tapestries depicted hunting scenes, their colors muted by time. Suits of armor stood sentinel in alcoves, their empty visors seeming to follow her progress. Portraits lined the walls, judging her with silent intensity. Every surface was covered in a film of undisturbed dust, as if the house held its breath, unwilling to acknowledge the intrusion. "Mr. Blackwood is in the library," the woman said, leading Ellie through a doorway on the left. The library was at least somewhat brighter, though sunlight felt filtered and weak. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained rows of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers and half-empty glasses, and behind it stood Julian Blackwood. He was a striking man, tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, were fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. He didn't offer a hand, didn't even rise from his chair. "Miss Albright," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Blackwood," Ellie replied, striving for a professional tone. "I'm pleased to be here. I understand you'd like me to restore the portrait of your mother, Beatrice." "Indeed." He gestured towards a covered canvas leaning against one wall. "It has been neglected." Ellie approached the portrait, her eyes sweeping over the protective cloth. She lifted a corner, then slowly drew it back, revealing the painting. Beatrice Blackwood stared back at her, a woman of formidable presence. The portrait was large, dominating, and rendered with a skill that hinted at a master artist. But something was off. Beatrice's gaze wasn't directed at the viewer, but slightly askew. A subtle tilt of the head, a barely perceptible narrowing of the eyes. It gave the impression she was looking at something, orthotomony, just beyond the canvas. "She was a remarkable woman," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The painting, it is a family heirloom. Its restoration is a matter of some importance." "I understand," Ellie said, already mentally cataloging the work needed. There was crackler, of course. The delicate network of fine cracks that came with age, and a significant amount of dirt and grime obscuring the detail. But it was more than that. The varnish was crazed, lifting in places, and the canvas itself felt peculiar, almost unnaturally taut. "I'll need to set up in the room adjacent to the gallery," Ellie said, referring to the space where the portrait had hung. Good light and plenty of room to work. Certainly, Julian replied, waving a dismissive hand. Mrs. Hawthorne will show you. I trust you'll keep me informed of your progress. Of course. The next few hours were a blur of unpacking, arranging her tools, and preliminary examinations. The gallery was a long, narrow room with a single arched window overlooking the moor. The air was colder here, damp and heavy. Another portrait of a man in military uniform hung on the opposite wall, its subject equally austere. Ellie worked meticulously, carefully cleaning a small section of the painting to assess the damage. The artist had used layer upon layer of glaze, building up the colors with astonishing precision. But as she worked, she noticed something that didn't quite fit. The brushstrokes around Beatrice's eyes were different, more frantic, less assured. As if the artist had been rushed or distracted, she stepped back, studying the portrait as a whole. There was a disconcerting stillness to Beatrice's expression, a chilling lack of warmth. It was a beautiful painting, technically flawless, but it felt wrong, like a perfectly constructed facade concealing something dark and unsettling. A sound behind her made her jump. Mrs. Hawthorne had left a tray of tea and biscuits, but Ellie hadn't heard her approach. The woman stood silently in the doorway, her pale face impassive. Is everything to your liking, Miss Albright? She asked. Yes, thank you, Ellie replied, forcing a smile. It is a beautiful room, Mrs. Hawthorne. Didn't respond, merely nodded and retreated. Disappearing as silently as she had come, Ellie returned to the portrait, the unsettling feeling growing stronger. She needed to understand the technique, the layers, the methods used to create this image. She ran her fingers lightly over the canvas, tracing the contours of Beatrice's face. And then she felt it, a subtle indentation. Barely perceptible to the touch, a seam, not a crack, not a tear. A seam running almost invisibly along the curve of Beatrice's cheekbone, vanishing into the dark background. As if something had been added to the canvas after the painting had been completed. Ellie's breath hitched. A seam. In a portrait of this age, a seam was a flaw. It was an impossibility, unless it was intentional. A meticulously concealed secret hidden beneath layers of paint and varnish. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her smallest scalpel, the blade gleaming under the portable worklight. This wasn't tea restoration anymore. This was archaeology. She carefully traced the seam, feeling for the point where the canvas had been joined. It was almost invisible, the artist having seamlessly blended the edges. Whoever had created this hidden space had been extraordinarily skilled. With painstaking precision, she eased the blade into the seam, slicing through the adhesive that held it closed. The canvas yielded with a barely audible sigh, and a small section lifted away from the frame, revealing a dark, rectangular recess, a hidden compartment. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something papery and brittle. She withdrew it carefully, laying it on her work surface. It was a folded letter, yellowed with age, the paper thin and fragile. The handwriting was elegant, looping and precise, penned in faded black ink. The letter was dated the 12th of July, 1958. Ellie unfolded it, her eyes scanning the elegant script. A confession, a meticulously detailed account of a terrible act. Asterisk, to whom it may concern, should this ever be found. I can no longer bear the weight of this secret. I was there that night. I saw it all. Arthur didn't fall. He was pushed. By Edward, my own brother. He claimed it was an accident, a drunken stumble during an argument. But I saw the look in his eyes, the cold, deliberate intent. Singwalder continued, recounting the events leading up to the death of Arthur Blackwood, Julian's uncle. Arthur had been a renowned botanist, a brilliant but eccentric man who had mysteriously fallen from the cliffs bordering the Blackwood estate. The death had been ruled accidental, a tragic consequence of too much wine and a reckless walk after dark. But this letter painted a different picture, a picture of cold, blooded murder. Asterisk, Edward was always jealous of Arthur's talent, his recognition. He wanted the estate for himself, and Arthur stood in his way. He manipulated the situation, ensuring that Arthur was alone, near the edge. And then he gave him a little push. The letter went on to detail the subsequent cover. Up. The carefully constructed narrative of accidental death, the silence enforced by Edward Blackwood's wealth and influence. The author, a woman named Clara, wrote of her guilt, her fear, and her eventual decision to conceal the truth, protecting her family's reputation at the cost of her own conscience. Asterisk, I have lived with this burden for too long. I pray that one day justice will be served, but I fear it will die with me. Asterisk, the letter was signed simply C. Ellie lowered the letter, her hands shaking. Edward Blackwood. Julian's grandfather, a respected member of the community, now revealed as a possible murderer. And Clara, who was Clara? A sister, a lover. The identity felt tantalizingly close, yet obscured by decades of silence. A shadow fell across her work surface. Ellie looked up, startled. Julian Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. Ellie instinctively covered the letter with her hand. I was just examining the canvas, Mr. Blackwood. I discovered a small imperfection, a seam. A seam. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the exposed edge of the canvas. "Let me see." Ellie hesitated, then reluctantly moved her hand. Julian's gaze burned into the hidden compartment, his jaw tightening. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the opening. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "A letter," Ellie replied, her throat suddenly dry. It is old. I haven't read it yet." "A lie, but a necessary one, Julian." Sighs narrowed. "A letter?" He reached for it, but Ellie quickly pulled it back. "I thought it best to document everything before disturbing it further. It is part of the restoration process." He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. "You've gone beyond your instructions, Miss Albright." "I was simply being thorough, Mr. Blackwood. I believe it is important to understand the history of the painting, its context. The history of the painting is irrelevant." He took another step closer, looming over her. "My only concern is its restoration, nothing more." He seemed rattled, more than rattled, actually afraid. "And that fear was focused solely on the letter, I think," he said, his voice regaining some of its composure, "that perhaps this restoration is more complicated than I initially anticipated." He circled her work table slowly, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. Ellie felt a primal instinct to protect herself, to put distance between them. "I've been thinking," Julian continued, stopping directly in front of her. "Perhaps it would be best if you stopped." Immediately, Ellie frowned. "Stopped, but I've barely begun." "I'll, of course, honor the terms of our agreement," he said, his tone shifting again, becoming almost conciliatory. "I am prepared to offer you a substantial sum far exceeding the original quote soon, if you were to simply return the portrait to its original condition and leave Blackwood Manor." He named a figure. It was more than Ellie had earned in a year, an outrageous amount of money, enough to set her up for life. "I don't understand," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" Julian didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his eyes cold and implacable. A flicker of something dark and dangerous crossed his face. "Consider it a professional courtesy, a gesture of goodwill," he paused. "And a strong recommendation." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating then. A floorboard creaked outside the door. "Mrs. Hawthorne." Ellie glanced towards the sound, a sudden wave of dread washing over her. She wasn't just restoring a painting anymore. She was unraveling a secret. A secret someone was willing to pay a fortune to keep buried. And she had a feeling that secret wasn't just decades old. It was still very much alive. The money sat heavy in Ellie's mind, an unspoken threat masked as a generous offer. Julian Blackwood didn't want the portrait restored. He wanted the past erased, and that only solidified her resolve to uncover the truth. "I am afraid that is not possible, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've accepted the commission, and I intend to complete it." His response had been chillingly polite, a tightly controlled mask of disappointment. "Very well, Miss Albright, I trust you." I'll proceed with caution. Now, hours later, sitting in the chilly gallery, the scent of turpentine and old canvas a small comfort, Ellie was immersed in research. The internet provided a sparse amount of information about the Blackwood family, mostly superficial articles about their philanthropy and social standing. But the real story, she knew, lay buried in the local archives. She drove into Savannah, the sky mirroring the gray mood within her. The Savannah Historical Society was a charmingly cluttered building, smelling of dust and decay, presided over by a kindly, bespectacled woman named Mrs. Abernathy. Arthur Blackwood, you say? Mrs. Abernathy tapped away at a keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. Oh yes, a tragic case. A prominent man, a real loss to the scientific community. Fell from the cliffs, they said. Terrible business. After a considerable search, Mrs. Abernathy unearthed a handful of newspaper clippings from the summer of 1958. The articles painted a picture of a shocked community, mourning the loss of a beloved figure. There were interviews with Arthur's colleagues, speculation about the cause of the fall, and a brief mention of the investigation. But the investigation had stalled quickly. No foul play was ever suspected, and the case was closed within weeks. One article caught Ellie's eye. It mentioned a sister, Clara Blackwood, who had been questioned by the police. Clara was described as reclusive, a delicate soul who had withdrawn from society after Arthur's death. There was no follow-up, no indication of whether she had ever provided any useful information. Ellie requested access to the police reports, but Mrs. Abernathy informed her that they were sealed, accessible only with a court order, dead end. For now, as she left the Historical Society, a familiar tightness gripped her chest. A fleeting image flickered behind her eyes, a darkened hallway, a hushed argument, a sense of overwhelming fear, fragments of a memory, elusive and indistinct. From her childhood, her parents, both historians, had often immersed her in their work, taking her to dusty archives and forgotten museums. She'd spent hours poring over old documents, absorbing the stories of the past. But there had also been secrets within her own family, secrets whispered behind closed doors, secrets that had ultimately shattered her world. Her parents had died when she was 10, in a car accident ruled accidental. But she always suspected there was more to it, a nagging intuition that the truth had been concealed, buried beneath layers of official narratives. The feeling mirrored her current situation, the weight of hidden truths pressing down on her. She understood on a visceral level the corrosive power of secrets. Determined to find another angle, Ellie decided to explore the antique shops that lined Savannah's historic district. She wandered from store to store, browsing through forgotten treasures, hoping to stumble upon something that might shed light on the Blackwood case. In a dimly lit shop crammed with Victorian furniture and dusty curiosities, she met Mr. Hemlock, the proprietor. He was a wizened old man with shrewd eyes and a knowing smile. "Looking for something specific, dear?" he asked, polishing a silver locket. "I am researching the Blackwood family," Ellie said hesitantly. "I am restoring a portrait for Julian Blackwood." Mr. Hemlock's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable. "The Blackwoods," he said, his voice low. "An old family seen a lot of history pass through these streets." He paused, then disappeared into the back of the shop, rummaging through a pile of old photographs. He returned a few moments later, holding a faded black and white print. "I found this amongst some estate sales a few years back," he said, handing it to Ellie. "Thought you might be interested." It was a portrait of Beatrice Blackwood, taken decades before the formal painting Ellie was restoring. Younger, vibrant, with a mischievous glint in her eyes. She was standing in the gardens of Blackwood Manor, a riot of roses blooming behind her. Ellie studied the photograph, struck by the contrast between the woman in the portrait and the stern, imposing figure depicted on canvas. This Beatrice radiated warmth and vitality. "Do you know anything about this photograph?" Ellie asked. "Not much, I am afraid. It came with a small notation on the back. Something about a hidden garden, a forgotten promise." Ellie flipped the photograph over, her heart quickening. Handwritten on the faded backing was a message, scrawled in the same elegant script as the confession letter. Asterisk, "The sundial knows the time. Where shadows fall, the truth lies concealed." The Blackwood estate had extensive gardens. Could that be a clue? A hidden location where Clara Blackwood had concealed more than just a letter. A wave of unease washed over Ellie. She wasn't just chasing a decades-old mystery. She was walking into something dangerous, and someone, she suspected, was watching her every move. She glanced up, instinctively scanning the antique shop. Mr. Hemlock was watching her, his eyes unreadable. And across the street, parked discreetly in the shadows, she thought she recognized the dark gray sedan that had been following her since she arrived at Blackwood Manor. The sundial, the message on the photograph, echoed in Ellie's mind, a cryptic breadcrumb leading her deeper into the Blackwood Labyrinth. She pulled up the estate map she discreetly photographed during her first arrival, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. The gardens were vast, sprawling across several acres, and nestled within them, marked only as ornamental on the antiquated map, was a labyrinth. She returned to Blackwood Manor, the gray sedan a silent shadow in her rearview mirror. Julian hadn't pressed her further about the letter, but the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. Mrs. Hawthorne's already glacial demeanor had become downright hostile, her eyes following Ellie with undisguised suspicion. The labyrinth was hidden behind a curtain of overgrown rhododendrons, a forgotten corner of the estate claimed by nature. The hedges were tall and dense, forming a maze of winding paths and dead ends. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. It felt wrong, a place of secrets and forgotten memories. Ellie navigated the labyrinthine paths, the sundial's position her only guide. The stone column was partially obscured by ivy, its gnomon casting a long, distorted shadow. Where the shadow fell, she searched, running her hands over the brickwork, feeling for anything out of the ordinary. Behind a particularly thick section of hedge, she found it. A small, stone gazebo, almost completely hidden from view. It was dilapidated and crumbling, the roof partially collapsed, but it was undeniably there. Nestled in a hollowed-out section of the floor was a metal box. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a shoebox, but it was heavy, solid. It was locked with a rusty padlock, the metal pitted with age. Ellie tried to pry it open with her scalpel, but the lock held firm. She rummaged through her kit, eventually finding a small crowbar. After a tense struggle, the lock snapped, releasing a metallic clang that echoed through the labyrinth. As she lifted the lid, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked in darkness, the face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "I wouldn't do that," a gravelly voice warned, cutting through the silence. Ellie froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Who are you?" "Someone who understands the importance of letting the past remain buried." "I'm just restoring a painting," Ellie said, her voice shaking. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble." The figure chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Trouble finds you when you start digging. Some things are better left undisturbed." "What is in this box?" Ellie demanded, clutching the crowbar tighter. "Things that don't concern you, secrets that could ruin lives." The figure took a step closer, and Ellie could make out the glint of metal in their hand, the small silver pistol. "Stay back," Ellie warned, raising the crowbar defensively. The figure lunged, attempting to disarm her. Ellie reacted instinctively, swinging the crowbar, connecting with the figure's arm. A grunt of pain, and the figure stumbled back, momentarily stunned. Ellie didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She sprinted through the labyrinth, blindly following the winding paths, the figure's heavy footsteps echoing behind her. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her clothes. She stumbled, falling to her knees, scraping her hands and knees on the rough gravel. She scrambled to her feet and pushed on, desperately trying to find her way out. Finally, she burst through the rhododendrons and into the open, collapsing onto the manicured lawn. Gasping for breath, looking back, she saw the figure standing at the edge of the labyrinth, silhouetted against the trees. They didn't pursue her, simply watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. Ellie didn't wait. She limped back to her Volvo, ignoring the stinging pain in her knees and the throbbing in her wrist. She started the engine and sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. Back in her temporary studio at Blackwood Manor, Ellie carefully examined her injuries. A few scrapes and bruises, nothing serious. But the encounter had shaken her to the core. Someone was protecting the Blackwood family's secrets, and they were willing to resort to violence to keep them hidden. She glanced at the metal box sitting on her work table. Fear gnawed at her, but her curiosity outweighed her apprehension. She had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet lining, was a collection of old letters. Bound together with a silk ribbon, the handwriting was the same elegant script as the confession letter and the message on the photograph. And beneath the letters, gleaming dully in the dim light, lay a tarnished silver locket. The letters were a revelation, a scandalous tapestry woven with longing, deceit, and ultimately tragedy addressed to Beatrice Blackwood from a man named Charles Davenport, a successful Savannah businessman. They detailed a passionate love affair that had spanned several years. An affair that had produced a son, Suni, not Julian's brother, Edward Jr., but a child conceived in secret, raised under a false pretense. Charles Davenport hadn't been a member of the Blackwood social circle. He'd been a confidant, a lover, and then a threat. The letters spoke of Beatrice's struggle with her feelings, her loyalty to her husband, and her growing desperation to protect her secret. Then the tone shifted, becoming laced with fear. Davenport had threatened to reveal the truth, to claim his son as his own. And then, abruptly, the letters stopped. A final, unsigned note tucked inside the last envelope confirmed Ellie's growing dread. It was a fragment of Clara Blackwood's confession, expanding on the information in the earlier letter. "Finny, father." Siler silenced him, said it was for the family, for our reputation. He arranged to meet Charles at the cliffs, ostensibly to discuss a business deal. But it was a trap. I saw it all from the window, a struggle, a push, and then nothing but the sound of the waves. Julian's grandfather hadn't simply covered up a murder, he'd orchestrated it. And Julian's father had perpetuated the lie, raising Edward Jr. Charles Davenport's son, Savannah, as his own heir. The entire Blackwood legacy was built on a foundation of deception and blood. Ellie found Julian in the library, staring out at the darkening moors. She hesitated, weighing her options. She could go to the police, but she doubted they'd believe her without concrete proof. And she wasn't sure she could trust the local authorities, given the Blackwood family's influence. She took a deep breath and walked into the library, the metal box clutched in her hands. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk." He turned, his expression unreadable. About the letters," she said, placing the box on his desk. "About Charles Davenport, about the truth of your family history." Julian's eyes narrowed as he examined the contents of the box. His face slowly paling, he picked up one of the letters, his fingers tightening around the brittle paper. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "I found them in the gazebo, hidden in the garden." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "The garden, always the garden. My grandmother was fond of secrets." "These aren't just secrets, Mr. Blackwood. These are evidence of a murder, a fabrication," he snapped, "a desperate attempt to tarnish my family's name. The handwriting matches the confession, and the details corroborate the historical records. Charles Davenport disappeared shortly after these letters were written. He was presumed lost at sea, but Clara Blackwood knew the truth." Julian remained silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then he began to speak, his voice measured and controlled. "My grandfather was a complex man, Miss Albright. He believed in protecting his family at all costs. Charles Davenport was a fortune hunter, a social climber who sought to exploit my grandmother's vulnerability. He threatened to expose her affair, to ruin our family's reputation. My grandfather saw no other option." "So you're admitting he murdered him?" "I'm saying he did what he had to do. He silenced a threat. It wasn't murder, it was preservation." "Preservation, you call cold-blooded murder preservation. I call it family loyalty. I call it the burden of legacy. We Blackwoods have always protected our own." His carefully constructed facade began to crumble, revealing a simmering rage beneath. "Do you have any idea what it is like to grow up knowing this, knowing the weight of this secret? To live under the scrutiny of a community that would tear us apart if they knew the truth? The truth matters, Mr. Blackwood. People deserve to know. The truth is a luxury we cannot afford. It would destroy everything." He stood up, pacing the library like a caged animal. "You don't understand. You weren't born into this. I understand that you're protecting a murderer." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Julian's eyes blazed with fury. "You have no right to judge my family," he roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "You have no idea the sacrifices we've made." He lunged towards the metal box, intending to sweep it off the desk and into the fireplace. Ellie instinctively reached out to stop him. "No," she cried. A struggle ensued, a chaotic clash of wills and desperation. Julian was stronger than she anticipated. Fueled by years of suppressed anger and a desperate need to protect his family's secrets, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. Ellie cried out, but she held on, refusing to let him destroy the evidence. He pushed her back, sending her stumbling towards the bookshelf. She grabbed for support, knocking over a stack of books. Julian advanced, his face contorted with rage. "This ends now," he growled, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You've dug too deep. You should have listened to me." He advanced again, aiming a forceful shove towards the heavy mahogany desk. Ellie braced for impact, a wave of terror washing over her. The weight of the Blackwood legacy, steeped in deceit and darkness, threatened to consume her. The mahogany desk loomed, a solid barrier against the fall. But Julian's intent was clear. He wasn't just trying to push her. He was trying to silence her permanently. Reacting on pure instinct, Ellie ducked, twisting her body to avoid the full force of his shove. As he stumbled past, she swung the metal box, connecting squarely with the side of his head. Julian staggered back, clutching his temple, a groan escaping his lips. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Ellie stood there, gasping for breath, her wrist throbbing. Her body trembling, she stared down at Julian's prone form, a mixture of fear and relief washing over her. She managed to stop him, but the encounter had left her shaken to the core. Ignoring the pain, she stumbled towards the telephone on Julian's desk and dialed 911. Her voice shaky as she reported the assault and the confession. The police arrived within minutes, sirens slicing through the still evening air. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, was suddenly swarming with officers, their flashlights illuminating the dark corners and shadowy hallways. Detective Inspector Davies, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened patiently as Ellie recounted the events, showing her the letters and the photograph. He examined the scene, noting Julian's unconscious state and the overturned furniture. "This is quite a story." "Miss Albright," Davies said, his expression grim. "A decades-old murder, a cover-up, and a family steeped in secrets." A thorough search of the Blackwood Manor was conducted, uncovering further corroborating evidence. Hidden financial records revealed payments made to individuals who had been silenced over the years. Old diaries confirmed Clara Blackwood's guilt and her desperate attempts to reconcile her conscience. And forensic analysis of the gazebo confirmed traces of a struggle. And potentially human remains. Julian Blackwood was taken into custody, charged with assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The local press descended on Blackwood Manor like vultures, eager to capitalize on the scandal. The Blackwood name, once synonymous with prestige and philanthropy, was dragged through the mud, its reputation irrevocably tarnished. The story dominated the headlines for days, the details of the murder and the subsequent cover-up laid bare for all to see. The truth about Arthur Blackwood's death, long buried beneath layers of deceit, finally came to light. The arrest of Julian Blackwood sent shockwaves through Savannah, society. The revelation that the family's wealth and power had been built on a foundation of lies and violence shook the community to its core. As the storm began to subside, Ellie found herself feeling a strange sense of emptiness. She had uncovered the truth, brought a murderer to justice, and exposed a family's dark secrets. But it hadn't brought her the closure she'd hoped for. She returned to the library, drawn back to the metal box and its hidden contents. She read the letters, each word a testament to the devastating consequences of lies and betrayal. But it was the tarnished silver locket that drew her attention. It was small and intricately engraved with the Blackwood family crest. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully opened it inside. She expected to find a miniature portrait, a lock of hair, some token of affection. Instead, she found a single, folded piece of paper. It was a final, unsigned letter, written in the same elegant script as the others. But this letter was T addressed to Beatrice Blackwood. It was addressed to her parents. Asterisk to Thomas and Eleanor Albright. TBI, fear my actions have placed your daughter in danger. My past is entangled with yours, a connection I desperately tried to sever. Julian knows about the agreement, the promise we made. He will stop at nothing to protect his family. Legacy. And he believes your daughter possesses information that could destroy it. Please protect her. She is the key to unlocking the final truth. Dully's blood ran cold, her parents. An agreement. What connection did her family have to the Blackwoods, and what promise had her parents made? The letter's final sentence chilled her to the bone. Asterisk, he knows about the lighthouse. Sighed the lighthouse. The abandoned lighthouse on the remote coastline, a place etched in Ellie's childhood memories as a symbol of mystery and loss. The place where her parents had taken her on their last trip, just weeks before the accident. The place she hadn't been able to remember clearly until now. A wave of dread washed over her, a terrifying realization dawning in her mind. The car accident hadn't been an accident. Her parents hadn't died as a result of a tragic mishap. They had been silenced, and Julian Blackwood, or someone connected to his family, was responsible. The truth, it seemed, had just begun to unravel, and Ellie, caught in the crosshairs of a decades-old conspiracy, was about to discover that her own past was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The letter trembled in Ellie's hand, the fragile paper a tangible link to a past she never knew existed. Her grandmother, Margaret Albright, had been a close friend of Beatrice Blackwood, a confidante, and she had known about the affair, the murder, the carefully constructed web of lies that had consumed the Blackwood family for generations. The letter detailed a clandestine meeting between Margaret and Beatrice, held just weeks before Arthur Blackwood's death. Beatrice had confided in Margaret, confessing her love for Charles Davenport and her fear of her husband. Edward's violent temper. Margaret, a woman of strong moral convictions, had urged Beatrice to end the affair, to protect herself and her family. But it was the final paragraph of the letter that sent a shiver down Ellie's spine. Margaret had discovered evidence of Edward Blackwood's manipulation, his attempts to control Beatrice and silence Davenport. She had threatened to expose him, to reveal the truth, and Edward, fearing exposure, had orchestrated a fishing trip for Margaret's husband, Thomas, and daughter, Ellie. A fishing trip, Ellie whispered, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. Her parents hadn't been simply driving along a coastal road. They'd been deliberately lured to a dangerous location. The car accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a calculated act of revenge. The fragmented memories of her childhood flooded back, clearer now. Sharper the unsettling feeling of being watched, the hushed conversations between her parents, the almost palpable sense of fear that had permeated their lives. It wasn't paranoia, it was a premonition. They had known they were in danger for years. She had blamed herself, convinced that somehow she had been responsible for their deaths, that her childhood anxieties had contributed to the accident. But now she understood she hadn't been to blame. She had been a victim of the same dark forces that had haunted the Blackwood family for decades. The weight of the past, the burden of unanswered questions began to lift. She wasn't defined by her trauma, she was a survivor. A woman who had dared to uncover the truth, even when it threatened to consume her. She spent the next few days quietly, allowing herself time to process her grief and to find a measure of peace. The police investigation was ongoing, but Julian Blackwood remained in custody, facing a litany of charges. The Blackwood estate was seized, its opulence fading under the scrutiny of legal proceedings. Then she returned to the gallery. To Beatrice Blackwood's portrait, she picked up her brushes, her hands steady, her heart filled with a newfound clarity. She wasn't restoring a symbol of deception. She was revealing a hidden strength, an unspoken sorrow. She worked with meticulous care, layer by layer, bringing Beatrice's image back to life. As she worked, she saw the woman in the portrait with new eyes, no longer stern and imposing, but vulnerable and conflicted. Beatrice hadn't been a perpetrator of the lies. She had been a prisoner of them, a woman trapped by duty, by societal expectations, by a dangerous and controlling husband. She finished the restoration, applying the final coat of varnish, allowing the colors to deepen and glow. The portrait now radiated a quiet dignity, a haunting beauty. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure even in the face of unimaginable hardship. She stepped back, studying her work. The subtle tilt of the head, the flicker of uncertainty in Beatrice's eyes, the carefully concealed secrets. It was all there, laid bare for all to see. She had sought to restore a painting, but she had ultimately restored something far more profound, a sense of truth, of justice, of peace. The Blackwood legacy would forever be tainted by scandal and tragedy, but within its ruins a seed of hope had been planted, a hope that future generations would learn from the mistakes of the past, that secrets would no longer be allowed to fester in the shadows, and that the weight of lies would finally be lifted. Ellie didn't stay to witness the aftermath. She packed her bags, leaving Blackwood Manor behind, and drove away, heading towards an uncertain future. But this time, she wasn't running from her past. She was embracing it, accepting it as a part of who she was. She carried the weight of what she had learned, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, truth would eventually prevail, and that sometimes the most beautiful things are found not in perfection, but in the cracks and imperfections, in the echoes of stories left untold.